Story number 1.
When I was 24, I took a job managing inventory at a small warehouse just outside Albany, New York. The job wasn't great. It was monotonous, and the building itself was old and freezing in the winter, but it paid more than my last retail gig and let me work evenings, which I preferred. I was a night owl, and there was something comforting about being alone with my thoughts while scanning barcodes and organizing boxes. The warehouse was a squat, long building that used to be a textile mill in the early 1900s. Management tried to keep it clean and somewhat updated, but it always smelled faintly of mildew and motor oil. The floors creaked in places, and the overhead lights buzzed even when no one was around. You got used to it after a while. My shift typically ran from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m., but during the last week of November that year, I volunteered to do overtime. Holiday shipments were piling up, and the manager was desperate for help. I started working until 2 or 3 in the morning. That's when things started getting strange. The first incident was subtle. It was about 1:30 a.m., and I was up on the mezzanine taking inventory of a shipment of outdoor heaters. I was focused, scribbling in my notepad when I heard a soft thud below me, like someone had dropped a heavy book on the concrete floor. I froze and listened. The warehouse was supposed to be locked up. I was the only one with the keys that night, and the security system had been armed. I glanced over the railing. Nothing. I shrugged it off as something falling off a shelf and went back to work. But 5 minutes later, I heard it again. Another thud, then a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I leaned over the edge again and saw nothing. I walked down the steps and looked around, flashlight in hand, but the warehouse was silent. No sign of anything fallen or out of place. I told myself it was probably a rodent or maybe even the old plumbing. But the next night, things escalated. I was back up on the mezzanine, this time logging some patio furniture. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps below. Clear, slow, steady steps moving down the center aisle. They stopped right beneath me. My heart was pounding as I crept toward the railing and peered over. There was no one, not a soul, but I could still hear faint breathing, not my own, shallow and slow like someone trying not to be heard. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" Silence. I went down again, flashlight shaking slightly in my grip. I checked every row, every corner, even the old office we barely used. Nothing. The air was thick with cold and that awful musty smell that always lingered in the building, only stronger now, like mold that had just been stirred up. I left the lights on that night. Usually I turn them off row by row as I finish scanning, but that time I left them all on and locked up fast. The third night was worse. That night I started noticing cold spots, areas that felt like the temperature had dropped 15 degrees. One in particular always hovered near the fair end of the warehouse, where we kept off-season merchandise. I would get chills just walking past that area, and twice I felt a weird pressure on my chest whenever I entered it, like someone pushing down on me, just enough to make me uncomfortable. But that wasn't the worst part. I had a small radio I kept on the main desk to play music while I worked. It was always tuned to the same classic rock station, low volume, just to break the silence. That night, as I was coming down from the mezzanine, I heard the radio turn off mid-song. I reached the desk and found it still powered on, but silent. I fiddled with the dial. Nothing. Then, just as I was about to unplug it, it let out this high-pitched whine, like microphone feedback, followed by static. Then I heard a voice. Not a song. Not a DJ. Just a voice, whispering. I couldn't make out what it said, but it repeated the same 3 or 4 words over and over. It sounded like, "down there," or maybe, "I'm here." I turned it off, unplugged it, and didn't plug it in again. The next day, I asked Tony, the janitor, if he'd ever noticed anything strange during his cleaning rounds. He was in his late 50s, worked there longer than anyone else. He gave me a look and said, "You been staying late?" I nodded. He hesitated for a second before saying, "That place has stories, man. Goes way back. Some old guy died in there back when it was a mill. Got crushed under some machine in the 30s, I think. They say sometimes he walks around at night." I laughed nervously, but he didn't smile. "You laugh," he said, "but I don't go past the break room after midnight. I clean the floors up front and I leave. You think I don't hear stuff? I hear it, but I ain't going looking for it." That night I nearly quit. I was logging some damaged items in the back when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. A tall, thin figure standing at the far end of the aisle. I turned, heart jumping into my throat. The figure didn't move, just stood there. The overhead light above it flickered once, then twice. When it stabilized, the figure was gone. I told myself I imagined it, that I was exhausted. But when I walked down the aisle to check, I found something that made me freeze. A long scratch down the metal shelving unit, almost 5 feet in length, as if someone had dragged a nail or blade along it. It hadn't been there earlier. I was sure of it. I took a picture with my phone and texted it to Tony. All he replied was, "Told you." By the end of that week, I was barely sleeping. I started having nightmares. Long, vivid dreams where I was walking through the warehouse, only everything was soaked in water and I could hear this horrible grinding sound, like gears turning or machinery failing. In every dream, I found myself drawn to the same corner of the building, the same cold spot. And in every dream, something was waiting for me there, tall, pale, and silent. I confided in my manager, Brian. He didn't laugh. He just asked if I'd been working alone all those nights. When I said yes, he sighed and told me, "You're not the first. We had a guy named Luis a couple years back. Same position, worked nights, quit after a month. Said he kept seeing someone watching him from the rafters." I didn't go back the next night. I needed a break. But on Monday, I returned, determined to prove to myself that it was all in my head. I told myself I was just tired, paranoid, and influenced by old stories. I got through most of the shift without incident. The building still felt heavy, but nothing happened. Not until closing time. I was wrapping up near the front entrance when I heard footsteps coming from the back. Fast ones, like someone running but with uneven strides. I froze. They got closer, echoing off the walls. Then they stopped. I couldn't move for a solid minute. My body just locked up. Then came the whispering, so soft I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It sounded like someone murmuring into a wall. I turned and booked it out of there, locked up, and drove home in silence. That was the last time I worked overtime. A couple months later, the warehouse had a minor electrical fire. Nothing major, but it damaged the back portion of the building. During the repairs, construction workers opened up one of the sealed walls near the cold spot. Inside, they found a small bricked-off room, maybe 6 feet by 6 feet, with rotting wooden beams and what looked like part of an old gear assembly from the mill days. There were old work gloves, rusted tools, and something else. A heavy leather apron with dark stains that hadn't faded. They called the Historical Society, who came and confirmed that during the 1930s, an employee named Ernest Dyer had died in that section of the building. Records showed he was alone when it happened, working on a malfunctioning press that jammed and collapsed on him. For some reason, the room had been sealed up not long after. Management kept the findings quiet. They didn't want media attention or lawsuits, but they stopped letting anyone work solo at night after that. I was moved to the afternoon shift, and Tony was given more hours to clean during the day. The whispers never came back. Neither did the figure. But sometimes when I lock up, I swear I still hear faint footsteps in the back. Just one or two. As if someone is still walking the floor. Waiting. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I grew up in a small, quiet town in the Midwest, and like many small towns, there were more stories about local legends and haunted places than I cared to remember. I used to laugh at them, especially when they were told around a campfire. But all of that changed when I took a job working the night shift at a local convenience store. The store had been around for decades. It wasn't much to look at, an old, square building with flickering neon lights that buzzed like insects at night. The air inside always smelled faintly of stale coffee and rubber. I started working there part-time while finishing my degree, and it was easy money. The hours were long and slow, and the town was small enough that we didn't get many customers after midnight. I had been working there for about 3 months when it first happened. It was a Tuesday night in late October, the week before Halloween, when the store seemed especially quiet. The other employee, Rick, had just left for his shift change, and I was alone, sitting behind the counter, barely paying attention to the television. I was half watching a rerun of an old sitcom when I heard the faint sound of footsteps coming from the aisle at the far end of the store. It was so soft I almost didn't hear it, but it caught my attention. I glanced up, but there was no one there. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the building settling. It was an old store, after all, and creaking and groaning were a part of its character. But then the footsteps came again, a little louder this time, moving toward the counter. I stood up slowly and walked toward the aisle, glancing down it as I reached the corner. It was empty. No one was there. I shook my head, laughing to myself at how jumpy I was becoming. It was probably just an animal or the wind. I went back to the counter, but the unease lingered. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my phone screen. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As the night wore on, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were closer, almost as if someone was walking behind me. I spun around, half expecting to see a customer who had slipped in quietly. But the store was still empty. I walked through the aisles again, checking the corners and the stockroom, but there was no one there. The air was cold, despite the fact that the heat had been on for hours, and a chill settled deep into my bones. I remember standing at the end of the store, staring at the flickering neon light outside, when I heard a soft voice, almost like a whisper. It came from behind me, too faint to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It sounded like someone trying to get my attention. I spun around, but once again, no one was there. My heart started racing, and I couldn't shake the sensation that something was wrong. It wasn't just the footsteps anymore. There was a presence, something unseen but very real. I glanced at the clock, only a few more hours until my shift ended. I could make it through. It was probably just my mind playing tricks, I told myself. I was tired, overworked. I couldn't let my imagination get the best of me. But the more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. The whispers became more frequent, almost as if they were speaking directly into my ear. Every now and then I'd hear a soft rustling, like footsteps brushing against the linoleum floor. I was beginning to feel paranoid, like someone was watching me from the aisles, hiding just out of sight. It wasn't until around 3 a.m. that I felt the temperature drop dramatically. I was used to the store being cold, but this was different, like a heavy, unnatural cold that settled into the room and made it hard to breathe. I walked over to the thermostat, but it read the same temperature as it had all night. I double-checked the doors to make sure no one had slipped in, but they were all locked. I started to feel dizzy, like the air was too thick, pressing in on me. That's when I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, this time coming from behind the counter. I turned around quickly, but no one was there. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and a sudden feeling of dread washed over me. My instincts screamed for me to leave, but I couldn't move. It was like my feet were glued to the floor. I looked at the clock again. It was almost 4 a.m., just one more hour before my shift ended. I told myself to hold it together, but then I saw it. In the far corner of the store, near the refrigerated section, a shadow moved. It wasn't natural, more like a dark, shifting figure, and it seemed to flicker in and out of sight as though it were a part of the darkness itself. My heart stopped, and I instinctively took a step back. The figure lingered for a moment before it disappeared into the shadows. I froze, unsure of what I had just seen. My mind raced, trying to explain it away. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. It was real. I gathered the courage to walk toward the corner, trying to keep my breathing steady. I flipped on the light above the refrigerators, but the corner was empty. The shelves were stocked, and there was nothing out of place. But the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, thick and suffocating, hanging in the air like smoke. The rest of the night was a blur. I tried to keep busy, folding towels and organizing the shelves, but the unease never left me. Every time I glanced at the corner, I felt that presence, watching me. The whispers continued, low and unintelligible, just out of reach. I started to question my sanity. I was exhausted, yes, but this felt different. This wasn't just stress or fatigue. When my shift finally ended, I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I grabbed my things, locked up, and stepped into the cold night air. I breathed deeply, trying to shake the feeling of being followed, but it clung to me like a shadow. It wasn't until I got into my car and started driving home that I felt like I could finally relax. The next day, I told myself that it had been a fluke, that I had just imagined everything. But as the days went by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there. The whispering, the shadow, the footsteps. It was all too real. I found myself dreading every night shift, knowing that sooner or later I'd have to go back to that store. One night, I worked a double shift. The store was dead quiet, just like it always was, but this time I was ready. I wasn't going to let whatever it was scare me. I stood by the counter, trying to distract myself with my phone. But the whispers came again, soft at first, then growing louder, more distinct. This time, I could make out the words, "Leave now." The voice was clearer than before, like a cold breath against my ear. I whipped around, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the aisle was empty. The temperature dropped again, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. This time, I didn't wait. I ran to the back door, unlocked it, and stepped outside into the night air. I never went back to that convenience store after that night. I didn't care if I was going to lose my job. I couldn't stay there. Whatever haunted that place was real, and I wasn't willing to stick around to find out what it wanted. I don't know if the store is still open, but if it is, I wouldn't recommend anyone taking a job there. And as for me, I've never been able to shake the feeling that something followed me out of that store that night. It's been years, but sometimes when I'm alone, I still hear the faint whispering. It's distant now, but always there, lingering at the edges of my mind. Leave now. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I don't talk about what happened at the old payphone station often. Not because I'm afraid of being laughed at, though that's definitely happened, but because even after all this time, thinking about it still messes with me. It was the fall of 2006, and I was living in a small town in northern Illinois, just outside Rockford. I'd been working the overnight shift at a warehouse off the I-90 for about 8 months. It wasn't a bad gig, boring, repetitive, but steady money. I lived with my girlfriend Dana at the time in a small, rundown duplex. We were both night owls, which made my shift work manageable. Dana worked part-time at a gas station down the street and took online classes during the day. We didn't have a lot, but we were making it work. One night, maybe a little after 2 a.m., I was driving back home from a shift. It was a Thursday, I remember that clearly. Thursdays were my short nights, only 6 hours instead of 10. I liked Thursdays because the roads were emptier, and I could get home before the real silence of the night set in. You know the kind, where even the crickets go quiet, and your headlights feel like they're the only thing carving a path through the dark. Anyway, I was driving along a 2-lane service road that cut through some woods and farmland on the way to the highway entrance. Not many people used it at that hour. As I rounded a bend, I saw something weird, a blinking red light in the distance. Not like a taillight or a hazard light. It was soft, low, and seemed to pulse in a rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. I slowed down. There was an old pull-off area coming up, half overgrown with weeds. Next to it was something I hadn't noticed before. An old payphone booth. Glass panels, mostly fogged or cracked, and the metal phone inside hanging loosely by its cord. It looked abandoned. I drove this road nearly every day and had never seen that booth before. I pulled over and parked. I just sat there staring at it. The red light was coming from inside the booth. I figured maybe someone had left something, maybe a dying flashlight or even a flare. I got out, left my engine running, and walked over. The cold hit me as soon as I stepped from the car, unusually cold for late September. My breath fogged the air. As I got closer to the booth, I could see more clearly. The light was coming from the receiver, like someone had jammed a tiny LED inside the earpiece. That didn't make sense. Phones didn't glow like that. I hesitated for a moment, then opened the glass door. The second I stepped inside, the red light blinked off, and the phone rang. Loud and sudden, I jumped back, heart hammering, and stared at the receiver. It rang again. It was a sharp, metallic sound, not like the old ringing I remembered from payphones. More aggressive, almost angry. It rang once more, then silence. I waited. I picked it up. Nothing. Then after about 5 seconds, I heard static, then a voice, but not like someone speaking into a phone. It was like a recording playing from somewhere far away, too faint and scratchy to make out. I pressed the receiver tighter against my ear. The voice grew louder, clearer. It was a child, a little girl, maybe 5 or 6. Her voice was trembling. "Hello?" she said. "Is anyone there? I can't find my mom. I froze. Where are you? I asked instinctively. The static shifted. A pause. I was in the car and now it's dark. I don't like the dark. Where are you calling from? I don't know. It's cold. There's water. There's a lot of water now. Then silence. The line went dead. I stood there staring at the receiver, not sure what I'd just heard. I stepped out of the booth, looked around. The woods were still, no wind, no movement. My car was idling on the roadside like nothing had happened. I got in and drove home faster than I ever had on that road. I didn't tell Dana about the call. I didn't know what to say. I barely slept. The next night, I couldn't get the booth out of my head. I told myself it had to be some prank, maybe one of those art installations or some weirdo with a speaker nearby. But I needed to see it again. On my way to work that night, I left early and took the same road. The booth wasn't there. I slowed down, drove the stretch twice. Nothing. Just woods and empty gravel where the pull-off had been. I was sure I hadn't imagined it. The red light, the cold, the call. It had happened. I went to work distracted and messed up my shift so badly my manager told me to take the weekend off. I agreed. That Saturday, Dana and I were watching TV when I brought it up. I didn't go into detail, just asked if she'd ever seen a payphone on the old service road. She frowned. That road by the Miller farm? Nah. That place hasn't had anything but trees since they tore the old way station down. I asked about the way station. Apparently, there used to be a rest stop back in the 80s, near where I saw the booth. It had been shut down after a flash flood killed a family traveling through during a storm. The flood swept their car into a drainage ditch that overflowed. The family drowned. Parents and their daughter. I asked when this happened. She shrugged. Sometime before I was born. Late 80s? The girl's voice came back to me. Cold. Afraid. There's water. A lot of water now. The next week, I drove the road every night. The booth never came back until October 18th. It was raining that night, hard. I was driving slow, trying not to hydroplane, when my headlights picked up something ahead on the shoulder, the booth. Just like before, red light blinking faintly from within. I pulled over, left the engine running, and walked toward it. The rain hit like needles, sharp and cold. As I got closer, the air changed again, colder, heavier. I opened the booth door and stepped inside. The red light died. The phone rang. Once, twice. I picked up. Silence, then static, then her voice again. But this time it was different. Slower. Hollow. Why didn't you come back? She asked. I didn't know what to say. Mom's gone, she said. She left me here. I'm sorry, I said. I tried. You said you'd help, she whispered. I didn't remember saying that. There was a long silence, then a sound like dripping water, then her voice again. They're coming now. Who? I asked. Then I heard something in the static, other voices. Not just one, dozens. Whispers, screams, some too quiet to understand, others too loud to ignore. They overlapped, surged, and then stopped all at once. She said one final thing. You shouldn't be here. The phone went dead. When I opened the booth door, the rain had stopped. The sky was clear, but my car was gone. I stood there alone on the side of the road with no sound, no light, just the booth behind me and the dark ahead. I walked up and down the shoulder, thinking maybe I parked farther than I remembered, but nothing. No sign of skid marks, no tire tracks, just silence. I walked 2 miles to the nearest farmhouse, knocked until someone answered. I told them I'd broken down. They called a tow truck. When the tow driver arrived, I told him where I'd parked. He gave me a strange look. There's no shoulder pull-off there, he said. Just trees. I insisted. He drove me back. We searched both sides of the road. No booth, no car. He eventually found my vehicle a 1/4 mile down the road, parked at an angle against a tree. No scratches, no damage. Still running. I didn't even remember moving it. The booth was gone. Again, that was the last time I ever saw it. I quit my job that week. Dana and I broke up 6 months later. I moved to Indiana, tried to forget about everything. But a few years ago, I got curious. I looked up the flood. It happened on October 18th, 1988. A family of 3, parents and their 6-year-old daughter. Their car was washed into a ditch while trying to turn around during a storm. The payphone at the way station was the last place they were seen alive. The mother had tried to call 911, but the line was busy. She hung up. They say she told her daughter to stay in the car while she went to find help. They never found the mother's body. Only the father and the girl still in the vehicle. I don't take back roads anymore. I still dream about the booth. Sometimes I wake up to the sound of a phone ringing, always 3 times. Story the end.
Story number 4.
When I moved to Pennsylvania to start my new job as a field surveyor for a mapping company, I wasn't expecting much beyond long hours, quiet nights, and a chance to finally save money. I rented a house just outside of a small town called Weatherfield, a place tucked into the wooded valleys where fog rolled in every morning and didn't always burn off by noon. The rental was an old farmhouse with a barn out back and a narrow creek that ran behind the property. I was told it had been empty for a couple years, but the owner assured me everything worked fine and the rent was cheap enough to overlook any quirks. I liked the solitude. After living in Philadelphia for 5 years, the silence out here was almost meditative. The first month passed without incident. My job kept me on the road most days, and I'd usually get home just after sunset, make something quick to eat, and collapse into bed. The house had this smell of dry wood and dust, like no one had opened the windows in a long time. But I didn't mind. It felt like the kind of place that needed someone in it again. It was a cold night in early October when I first noticed something strange. I was up late reviewing maps in the living room, drinking coffee, when I heard footsteps upstairs. Clear as day, slow, heavy footsteps, walking from one end of the hallway to the other. I froze. The house creaked, sure, and wind sometimes rattled the windows, but this was different. This was deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer and crept upstairs, heart pounding. I checked every room. Nothing. The attic door was shut, and when I opened it, the space beyond was filled with cobwebs and old insulation, untouched. I tried to shake it off as my imagination. Maybe the house was just settling. Maybe it was raccoons. Anything but what it sounded like. A few days later, I started waking up at exactly 3:12 a.m. every night. Not 3:11, not 3:13. Always 3:12. My phone's lock screen would glow with the time, and I'd feel this cold draft in the room. No windows were open, no fans on. I even checked the heating ducts to make sure nothing was blowing in from outside. There was nothing logical about it. And I'd always woke up feeling watched. One night, when I couldn't get back to sleep, I wandered into the kitchen to drink some water. That's when I saw it for the first time. The back door had a glass window, and beyond it, just at the edge of the barn's shadow, stood a figure. A woman, barefoot, wearing something like a nightgown or slip soaked to her knees. Her face was tilted slightly like she was listening. I stood there, frozen, my glass of water halfway to my lips. She didn't move, didn't knock, just stood there. I turned on the porch light, and in the instant it blinked on, she vanished. I rushed outside, half expecting to find footprints in the dew or wet grass, but there was nothing, not a trace. My heart thudded against my ribs, and I locked every door and window before going back to bed. That's when the dreams started. They were vivid, suffocating dreams of water. I'd be sinking in a dark river or trapped beneath a frozen lake, banging on the ice while someone watched from above. Every time I woke up gasping, tangled in the sheets, drenched in sweat. The strangest part came a week later when I found something in the barn. I hadn't spent much time in there. It was filled with old equipment and the smell of mold. But I decided to clean it out one Sunday, just to keep busy. As I pulled back a stack of rotted lumber in the far corner, I noticed a hatch in the floor. It was covered in a thick layer of grime and rusted shut. I pried it open with a crowbar and shone my flashlight down. A narrow wooden staircase descended into darkness. I called the owner and asked if they knew about it. They didn't. They said as far as they knew, the barn didn't have a basement. Against every instinct in my body, I went down. The air grew colder with each step. At the bottom, I found a small room, stone walls, damp floor, and in the center, a well. An actual well, capped with old boards. There were markings carved into the stone walls, old and mostly illegible. I don't know why, but I lifted one of the boards covering the well. Just one. I heard dripping water echoing deep down, and then something else. Breathing. A long, shuddering inhale like someone had just woken up. I slammed the board back in place and bolted upstairs, locking the hatch behind me. That night, the woman came back. This time, she was closer to the house, standing in the yard beneath the kitchen window. Her head twitched in short, unnatural movements like a broken puppet. I watched from the dark, heart hammering. She tilted her head toward me. Her mouth opened slowly, but no sound came out. I backed away from the window, tripped over a chair, and when I looked again, she was gone. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd inhaled mold spores in the barn. Maybe I was hallucinating. But things got worse. I started hearing her inside the house. Water would turn on by itself, the kitchen sink, the upstairs shower. The smell of wet earth and mildew would fill the rooms for no reason. One night, I heard a woman crying downstairs. It was soft, like someone trying not to be heard, and it stopped the moment I turned on the lights. The final straw came 2 nights later. I had locked the doors, checked every room, and left all the lights on before I went to bed. I took a sleeping pill, desperate for a full night's rest, but I woke up again at 3:12 a.m. This time, not to silence, but to the sound of water rushing. I bolted upright and realized it was coming from the bathroom. I ran in and the tub was filled to the brim. The faucet still on and floating in the water was a dress. An old-fashioned, white lace dress, stained at the hem, swaying as if someone had just stepped out of it. I didn't own anything like that. I drained the tub, picked the dress up with tongs, and locked it in the shed out back. The next morning, it was gone. I packed my things that day. I didn't care about the deposit. I didn't care about the job. I just needed to leave. Before I left town, I stopped by the local library and asked about the farmhouse. The librarian, an older woman who looked like she'd been there forever, went pale when I mentioned the address. "That house used to belong to the Adler family," she said quietly. "Back in the 1940s, they lost their daughter, Lena. She went missing one night. They searched everywhere, but she was never found. People said she was odd, spoke to herself, always down by the creek or in the woods. Her mother said she sleepwalked, that she used to wake up standing outside in the middle of the night." I asked if they ever found her body. "They never did," she said, "but a neighbor once swore she saw someone in the barn years later, dressed in white, soaking wet, just staring at the well." I drove away that afternoon. I didn't stop. I didn't even tell the owner I was leaving. I figured he'd find out soon enough. I haven't had the dreams since I left, but I still wake up at 3:12 sometimes, heart pounding, certain that if I looked out the window, she'd be there. She'd be watching. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It was the fall of 2014 when I moved into the old 3-story Victorian house on Carlton Street in Buffalo, New York. I just turned 31, had ended a long-term relationship, and was looking for a fresh start. My lease had expired, and I was bouncing between friends' couches when I stumbled across the listing. The rent was shockingly low for the size and condition of the place. 3 bedrooms, hardwood floors, a fenced-in yard. It was managed by a small local property group, and I figured I got lucky. The previous tenant had apparently left in a hurry. I remember the woman showing the place mentioning it vaguely, something about a family emergency and relocating out of state. I didn't ask questions. At that point, all I wanted was a bed and some privacy. The house had character, no doubt about that. A winding staircase with ornate railing, high ceilings, a basement that smelled faintly of dust and metal, and doors that creaked even when you just looked at them. But I liked it. It was the kind of place that made you feel something had happened there. It didn't take long before things started to feel off. At first, it was subtle. I'd leave my keys on the kitchen counter and come back 10 minutes later to find them on the coffee table. I thought I was being absent-minded. Then it started happening with bigger things. My phone, wallet, even a pair of shoes I found halfway up the staircase one morning when I swore I'd left them by the front door. I chalked it up to the stress of the move and the breakup. But one night, about 3 weeks in, I woke up around 2:30 a.m. because I heard footsteps upstairs. That made no sense. I lived alone. The attic wasn't finished, just beams and insulation. No floorboards to walk on, nothing up there but a few old boxes from the previous tenant, which I'd already planned to sort through. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Not the soft settling of an old house, but the heavy creak of someone walking heel to toe. I lay there in bed, barely breathing. The sounds stopped above me, right over my room, then nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I went up into the attic with a flashlight. Dust everywhere, a broken rocking chair, a cracked mirror leaning against the wall, and the boxes. I opened a few, Clothes, Christmas decorations, some photo albums. Nothing that screamed weird. No raccoons or birds either. I didn't hear the footsteps again for a few days, but that sense of being watched never left. I started leaving lights on in rooms I wasn't using just so the house didn't feel so hollow. My friends told me I was being dramatic, and honestly, I agreed. I figured my nerves were just fried from the stress. Then came the knocking. It started on a Thursday. I remember because I was in the middle of making dinner, and it came from the basement door. 3 slow knocks. That door was down a narrow hall off the kitchen. I thought maybe it was the neighbor checking in. I'd met an older man 2 doors down, Mr. Whitaker, who had mentioned he sometimes checked on the property before I moved in. I opened the basement door. No one was there. I stood at the top of the stairs looking down into the dark. No movement, no sound. I flipped the light on. The bulb flickered, then steadied. I called out, "Hello?" Nothing. I closed the door, locked it, and went back to my pasta like nothing had happened. But the next night, it happened again. Same time. 3 slow knocks. I didn't open it. I just sat at the kitchen table staring at the door. After 5 minutes, I heard the knock again, but this time from the inside of the basement. I swear on my life, it came from under the door, like someone was standing on the stairs knocking upward. I didn't sleep that night. I called the landlord the next day, asked if there had ever been issues with break-ins or squatters. She said no, but mentioned the last tenant had called about strange noises too. I pressed her, but she brushed it off as mice or pipes. That wasn't mice. I started locking my bedroom door at night. I kept a hammer under my bed. I started having dreams. Dark ones, full of shadows and whispering voices I couldn't understand. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my mouth dry, my chest tight like someone had been sitting on it. One morning, I woke up with dirt on my sheets. I remember staring at it, unsure how it got there. It was dry, dark soil like what you'd find in a graveyard. I checked my feet, clean. Checked the bedroom floor, no dirt. I stripped the bed, threw the sheets in the wash, and tried not to think about it. That night, I set up my phone to record audio while I slept. I left it on the dresser near the door and hit record before lying down. The next morning, I listened. At first, just the usual sounds, me shifting, the creak of the bed. Then, at around 3:17 a.m., I heard it, a soft click, the sound of the doorknob turning. Then the door creaked open. But I never woke up. Heavy footsteps across the wooden floor, a low, humming sound like someone breathing through their teeth. Then something whispered. I couldn't make out what. The whispering went on for maybe a minute. Then silence. The recording ended at 4 a.m. I checked the door. It was still locked. I checked the file again. Same thing. I didn't sleep that night or the next. I stayed at a friend's place for a few days. When I came back, the house felt different. Colder. Heavier. Like something had noticed I'd left. I started keeping my lights on all night. I kept the hammer next to me on the couch, barely slept. One night, maybe a week later, I was sitting in the living room watching TV when the front door unlocked. I heard the deadbolt slide. I froze. Then the handle turned. I stood up slowly. The door opened an inch, just enough for cold air to slip in, and then slammed shut with a bang that shook the windows. I didn't wait. I called the police. They arrived 20 minutes later, checked the property, no sign of forced entry, no prints, no one outside. I told them about the door unlocking. One of the officers looked at me and said, "You sure it wasn't wind?" I moved out 2 days later. I stayed with friends for a month before finding a small apartment downtown. Clean, new building, lots of windows, nothing creaks. I sleep better now. But I never forgot that house. A few months later, I looked up the address out of curiosity. There wasn't much, but I found an old news clipping from the 60s. Apparently, a man had died in the attic, hanged himself from the rafters. He'd been missing for weeks before a neighbor noticed the smell. The article said he was a recluse, barely left the house. His name was Arnold Grayson. I tried to find more, nothing. But the photo of him in the article stuck with me. It was a grainy black and white, his face half shadowed. But his eyes, they looked familiar. I went back into my phone, found the audio file I'd recorded. I sent it to a friend who worked in sound engineering, asked him to clean it up. He ran it through filters, enhanced the audio. He sent me the final version. The whispering was clearer. And the last thing it said right before the recording ended was, "I like your bed. I used to sleep there." Story the end.
Story number 6.
I was never someone who believed in ghosts. My mother was deeply religious, my father a firm believer in science, and I was raised somewhere between the two, skeptical of anything without proof. That changed in 2019 when I took a job in central Maine, working as a property inspector for a private real estate firm. The job involved checking remote properties, most of them old, abandoned homes, inherited by distant relatives, or left in legal limbo. It was boring work. At least it had been. In October of that year, I was assigned to inspect a rural farmhouse just outside of Newfield. The client, a woman named Judith T., lived in Oregon and had inherited the place after the sudden death of her uncle, who had been living as a recluse for nearly 20 years. The house had supposedly been built in the 1880s, passed down through the same family line for over a century. According to Judith, no one had been inside the house since her uncle's body was discovered by a local deputy after a welfare check. I was told the man had died of a heart attack. Natural causes. No investigation. No foul play. It was a cold, gray morning when I drove out to the property. The GPS got confused somewhere outside of Newfield, and I ended up relying on handwritten directions. The road became a muddy track through thick pine woods with no sign of other homes. After 20 minutes of nothing but trees and mud, the farmhouse appeared. 2 stories. Pale green wood siding faded to gray, windows clouded with dust. There was a barn out back, half collapsed, and an old well with a wooden roof. The front door was locked with a rusted padlock, but the key Judith had mailed me worked. The hinges groaned as I pushed the door open. The air hit me first. Musty, dense, laced with something faintly metallic. Not quite blood, not quite rot, but close enough to both that I took a step back. The interior was surprisingly intact. Furniture was still in place. There was a dusty recliner in the living room, a coffee table with an ashtray filled with old cigarette butts, and books stacked in uneven towers. The kitchen had dishes in the sink, mold clinging to the edges of bowls and cups. A clock on the wall had stopped at 2:17. I made notes on the condition of each room, took photos, recorded structural damage, and moved upstairs. The master bedroom looked as if someone had walked out and never returned. The bed was unmade, the covers crumpled and slightly off the mattress, and a photo album lay open on the nightstand. I flipped through it and saw old black and white photographs, children playing near the barn, a man in a 1950s pickup truck, a group of people in front of the house on a sunny day, all of them smiling. I closed the book and set it down, but as I did, I noticed a small, pale handprint on the wall above the headboard. Child-sized. Dust-free. I frowned. I hadn't seen anything else to suggest a child had lived there recently. The handprint looked recent, like it had been made that day. I touched it. It was cold, damp even. That was the first time I felt uneasy. I took a photo and moved on. The guest room had a locked closet. I debated breaking it open. It wasn't required for my report, but something about it gnawed at me. I tried the other keys on Judith's ring, and one clicked the lock open. The door swung out slowly, and I nearly gagged. The smell was worse than anything else in the house, like something wet and long dead. The closet was empty except for a large wooden box about the size of a trunk. It had iron hinges and a heavy latch, no lock. I opened it. Inside were dozens of dolls. Old dolls. Some porcelain, some cloth, some with glass eyes and cracked cheeks, others hand-stitched. They were filthy, covered in dust and grime. But what made me recoil was the way they were positioned. Each doll had its arms raised, hands outstretched as if reaching for something, or someone. One of them, smaller than the rest, had nails driven through its eyes. I closed the box and stepped back, shutting the closet door and locking it again. My hands were shaking. By the time I returned to the first floor, it was late afternoon. The sky outside had darkened, though I hadn't seen any sign of clouds. I sat down in the living room to finalize my notes and call Judith. My phone had 1 bar of service, enough to get through. She answered on the second ring. I told her the condition of the house, described the damage, and asked if she knew anything about the dolls. Her voice went quiet. "No," she said. "He never talked about his past. The only thing I know is that he had a sister who drowned in the well when they were children. I don't even know her name. He never liked to talk about her." I wrote that down and thanked her. Before hanging up, she added something else. "He never had any children." but he used to leave a room set up like a nursery. Said it was for her. I thought he meant a cat or something. I didn't respond. I hung up, packed my things, and left the house, locking the front door behind me. I should have left it there, should have driven back to Portland and filed my report. But something pulled me back. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the dolls, about the handprint, about the smell in that closet. Around midnight, I looked through the photos I had taken. One of them, taken in the hallway near the staircase, showed something I hadn't noticed before. A reflection in the glass of a picture frame. A small, pale face, eyes dark and mouth slightly open, as if whispering. It was behind me. I hadn't seen anyone in the house. I told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe a smudge, maybe even my own reflection. But I knew it wasn't. The next day, I drove back to the property. I parked farther down the road this time and walked up to the house on foot. The forest was silent. No birds, no wind. The house loomed ahead of me, still and waiting. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air felt heavier, like walking into a thick fog. I went straight to the closet, reopened the trunk, and took more photos of the dolls. As I examined them, I noticed something I'd missed. The smallest one, the one with nails in its eyes, had hair that didn't match the rest. It wasn't synthetic. It looked real, human. I stepped back and nearly tripped. That's when I heard it. A soft, wet giggle from upstairs, a child's voice. I froze. It came again, a whisper this time. I see you. I backed toward the front door, every instinct screaming to run. The door slammed shut on its own. I turned and yanked it open, but it wouldn't budge. I heard footsteps above me, quick, darting from one room to the next. Then the sound of something dragging. I ran to the kitchen and climbed out the window, tearing my jacket on the sill. I hit the ground running, didn't stop until I reached my car. I looked back once. A curtain moved in the upstairs window. Just slightly. Enough. I filed my report and recommended the house be demolished or sealed. I didn't include the dolls or the voices or the face in the photo. I couldn't. No one would believe it. Judith sold the land 6 months later. I don't know who bought it. A year after the incident, I was reorganizing my digital files when I noticed something odd. A new folder, unnamed, containing 3 images I didn't remember taking. All were photos of the guest room closet. The final image was pitch black, but when I adjusted the brightness, I saw the outline of a child standing behind the trunk. Head tilted, smiling. I deleted every photo I had from that inspection. Burned my paper notes. I moved across the country and changed jobs. I still don't believe in ghosts, but I never go near wells. Story the end.
Story number 7.
My grandmother's house had always been the family gathering place. A creaky, old 2-story home in northern Pennsylvania. It sat on the edge of a forest, the kind of place you'd find on a postcard if the postcard was trying to unsettle you. It wasn't outwardly haunted looking. No boarded-up windows or ivy crawling up the sides, but the house always had a strange air about it. It smelled of wood and dust, and the corners always felt a little too dark, even in the daylight. When I was 10, I asked my grandmother why the basement door had 3 locks on it. She didn't answer. She just looked at me, held my face in her wrinkled hands, and said, "Some places in this house don't belong to us." Then she walked away. That stayed with me for years. After she died, the house passed to my mom, who had no interest in it. She was an only child and had moved to Florida decades earlier. I was 28 at the time, between jobs and trying to escape a string of poor decisions in Philadelphia. When she asked if I could go up and look after the property, check the pipes, mow the yard, keep the place from falling apart, I said yes without thinking. I packed up my car and drove 5 hours north, assuming I'd spend a couple weeks up there, maybe a month at most. But once I got there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd walked into something unfinished. The first few days were quiet. I cleaned out the kitchen, threw away food that had expired in 2017, dusted off the furniture. The house had power and the water ran clean, which surprised me. There was no Wi-Fi, but my phone got a couple bars near the windows, enough to check emails and get the weather. The first night, I stayed in the upstairs bedroom I used to sleep in as a kid. It hadn't changed. Same quilt, same dresser with the one sticky drawer, same cross above the door. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. The house was old. I chalked it up to settling wood, raccoons in the attic, anything logical. but the sound was too rhythmic, steady, like someone pacing back and forth. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and opened the door. The hallway was empty, but something strange happened when I stepped out. The air got cold, not just cooler, sharp. I could see my breath. I checked the thermostat downstairs. It was set to 72. I touched the walls, they were warm. I returned to bed, trying to rationalize what I'd felt, but that feeling, the one where the hairs on your arms stand up, lasted until sunrise. On the third night, I heard the basement door open. I was brushing my teeth in the upstairs bathroom when I heard the click, that familiar, unmistakable sound of a lock unlatching. Then the slow groan of the door opening. I froze. There were 3 locks on that door. I had checked them earlier that day. All 3 had been bolted. I turned off the faucet and listened. Nothing. Just the creak of the old house and the wind through the trees outside. Then came the sound of something dragging. It was low, like a heavy piece of cloth being pulled across the floor. Then a thud. Then silence again. I didn't go downstairs. The next morning, I found the basement door closed. All 3 locks were still latched, but there was a fresh scrape on the wooden floor just in front of it, like something had been dragged out and then back in. I started sleeping on the couch with the TV on. On the 5th day, I decided to go into the basement. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I couldn't let my imagination get the better of me. I remembered the layout, the narrow stairs, the single exposed light bulb hanging on a cord, the old freezer, the shelves stacked with canning jars and tools. I waited until noon when the sun was brightest and unlocked all 3 bolts. The door creaked open like it had been waiting. I stood at the top of the stairs for a full minute before stepping down. Each step groaned beneath me. The light bulb flickered when I pulled the chain but stayed on. The basement was just as I remembered, damp, cool, smelling faintly of mildew and old cement. Everything was where it should have been, except one thing. In the far corner of the room, beside the water heater, was a chair, a wooden rocking chair. I had never seen it before. It wasn't dusty like the rest of the basement. It looked recently placed, clean even, and it was facing the wall. I stared at it for a long time. Then it rocked. Just once. Back, then forward. No wind, no vibration from the floor, just a single deliberate motion. I turned and walked out, closing the basement door behind me. I didn't lock it. Somehow, locking it felt useless. That night, I dreamed of my grandmother. She stood in the kitchen looking exactly like she did in her 60s. Her mouth was moving, but no sound came out. Then she turned toward the basement door. It was open. Something long and thin crept up the stairs behind her, like an arm, but impossibly stretched. She didn't see it, or maybe she did, and she didn't care. When I woke up, my bedroom door was open. I was sure I had closed it. Over the next few days, I started hearing voices. Faint, like whispers through a wall. Sometimes they were behind me, sometimes under the floor, always unintelligible. They didn't sound angry, just wrong, like a radio tuned between stations, garbled words spoken too close to the ear. I began finding things in different places. My toothbrush in the sink, my shoes on the stairs. Once, my car keys were in the fridge. I started writing notes to myself, placing Post-its on the door to remind me where I left things. But that didn't stop it. Then, one night, I saw someone in the yard. It was after midnight. I had turned off the TV and was walking toward the kitchen when I saw a shape through the window. A figure. Not moving, just standing beneath the tree at the edge of the forest. I flicked the porch light on, but it didn't help much. The figure didn't react, just stood there. I went outside, holding a flashlight. The figure was gone. No footprints, no movement, nothing but silence. When I turned back toward the house, I saw something that made my stomach twist. The basement light was on. I hadn't been down there in days. I hadn't touched the light. I walked slowly toward the door. The locks were all bolted, but the light was on. The next morning, I packed my things. I told my mom I couldn't stay there anymore. She didn't ask questions. Maybe she understood. I drove back to Philadelphia and tried to forget, but the house didn't forget me. A week later, I started waking up at 2 or 3 a.m. every night, always the same time. I'd wake up gasping, heart pounding, covered in sweat. Sometimes I'd find things moved in my apartment, lights left on, cabinets open. Once I found a single muddy footprint on the carpet, too large to be mine. Then the photos started appearing. Old photos. Printed, like from a film camera. They'd be tucked under my door or slipped into my mailbox. Each one showed a part of my grandmother's house: the staircase, the kitchen, the view from the upstairs bedroom, but they weren't empty. In each photo, a shadowy figure stood somewhere in the frame, in the hallway, by the window, on the basement stairs. It was always blurry, tall, out of proportion, like its limbs were just a bit too long. I stopped sleeping. I started drinking. I considered therapy, but how could I explain any of this? One night, I heard a knock at my apartment door. 3 knocks. Slow. Deliberate. I looked through the peephole. Nothing. But when I turned back toward the living room, the lights flickered, and there, standing in the far corner, was the rocking chair, the same one from the basement. I hadn't brought it with me. I hadn't even touched it, but there it was, and it was rocking. Slowly. Back and forth. I moved the next morning. I've never gone back to my grandmother's house. It still sits there, empty, locked up, windows boarded, but sometimes I see photos of it online. Local real estate sites trying to offload it. And in one of them, just one, a blurry picture of the basement, I saw it again, the chair, still facing the wall, still waiting. Story the end.
Story number 8.
I didn't believe in ghosts, or at least I told myself I didn't. Most people probably say that until something happens that doesn't fit into their version of the world. I'd had my share of weird dreams, eerie feelings, unexplained creaks in the night, but I always blamed it on something rational. Faulty wiring, drafts, overactive imagination. That all changed in the fall of 2017 when I took a freelance job in rural Virginia documenting old historical sites for a preservation nonprofit. The work itself wasn't strange, just photographing and cataloging structures, mostly homes and barns from the 1800s. But one site in particular stood out, a house on the edge of Shenandoah County, mostly forgotten by time and badly overgrown. The property was simply listed in our documents as Ellis House, with no further notes, no photos, just a hand-drawn map marking its location near a bend in an old dirt road. It took me almost an hour to find the driveway. It was so overrun with brush and weeds that I almost missed it entirely. I had to park and hike the rest of the way in, gear slung over my shoulder, sweat already trickling down my back, despite the cool weather. The house was nestled in a hollow, partially obscured by thick woods and almost swallowed by nature. Vines crept up the siding. The roof had partially collapsed in the back, and one of the windows had a tree branch jutting through it. I took a few exterior shots, circled the building, then tried the front door. To my surprise, it opened with a long, dry groan. The inside smelled like damp wood and rotting plaster. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and dust swirled in the beams of light filtering through broken slats. I took careful steps, testing each board before committing my weight. The interior was stripped bare, no furniture, no curtains, just scraps of paper and broken glass littering the corners. I made my way through what had once been the kitchen, snapping photos and taking notes, then paused near a narrow doorway under the stairs. The door was closed, painted the same dull gray as the walls, like almost blending in. I tried the knob, but it wouldn't budge. I was about to move on when I heard a soft tapping sound, 3 distinct knocks from the other side of the door. I froze. I wasn't imagining it. It had been deliberate, rhythmic, not a branch, not an animal. I pressed my ear to the wood. Nothing. I backed away slowly and made my way upstairs, though my hands had started to shake. The second floor was in worse shape, the ceiling partially collapsed in one room, water damage staining the walls. I didn't stay up there long. The whole time I was up there, I felt watched. Not just that uneasy feeling people get in abandoned places. This was heavier, like I was being evaluated. I finished up as fast as I could, took my final photos, and headed outside. As I stepped off the porch, I felt something sting my calf. I looked down, thinking I'd been bit by a bug or scratched by a thorn, but there was nothing there. Just a single line of red across my skin, like a fingernail scratch. I didn't waste time trying to rationalize it. I packed up and left. That night, I woke around 2:30 a.m. to the sound of knocking. Not from the door. This was inside my apartment. 3 knocks coming from the back of my bedroom closet. I sat upright, heart pounding. The noise stopped immediately. I checked the closet. Nothing inside but coats and shoes. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had brought something back with me. Over the next week, things escalated. It started with small things. My toothbrush moved, lights flickering, my phone ringing with no caller ID and cutting off as soon as I answered. Then it got worse. One night I woke up to find my bedroom door wide open. I always closed it. I live alone. The air was cold, so cold I could see my breath, even though it was September and I hadn't touched the thermostat. I heard faint footsteps in the living room, the soft creak of the floorboards. But when I got up and checked, the room was empty. A couple days later, I noticed something strange in one of the photos I'd taken at the Ellis house. It was an interior shot of the upstairs hallway. In the far back, barely visible at the edge of the frame, was what looked like a face. Pale, blurred, as though someone had been peeking out from behind a doorway. I hadn't seen anyone when I was there. I zoomed in, adjusted the exposure, but the details stayed vague. Still, the eyes were clear, deep, empty, staring directly into the camera. I sent the photo to my supervisor, but she dismissed it. Probably a smudge or reflection, she said. I didn't push it. That night, I heard the knocking again. 3 knocks from inside my bedroom wall. I got up, turned on every light in the apartment, and didn't sleep the rest of the night. I couldn't explain it. I tried burning sage, something a friend recommended, even though I didn't believe in it. It didn't help. If anything, things got worse. I began seeing shadows moving in the corners of my vision. Not small flickers, full human-sized shapes that would vanish when I turned to look. I stopped sleeping properly, too afraid to close my eyes for long. One night, I woke gasping for breath, my chest tight, unable to move. Classic sleep paralysis, I thought at first, but then I realized the room was freezing again. I could hear breathing, not mine, something slow and raspy right next to my ear. I strained to move to turn my head, but I couldn't. Then I felt it, fingers wrapping around my wrist. Cold, unmistakably real. They squeezed once, hard enough to bruise, and then let go. I bolted upright, drenched in sweat, and found a dark bruise already forming on my arm. I knew then that whatever this was, it wasn't just some psychological episode. I needed help. I reached out to a local historian who specialized in abandoned properties in Virginia. We met in a cafe near my place, and I showed him the photos, told him everything I'd experienced. He was skeptical at first, but when I mentioned the Ellis house, his expression changed. "You said Ellis house?" he asked. I nodded. "I thought they tore that place down years ago." I showed him the photos I took, the timestamp, GPS tag. He shook his head slowly. "That house has a reputation. The family that built it, Ellis's, moved there after the Civil War. Strange folks. The father disappeared one winter. Just never came home from the woods. The mother died in childbirth. That left the oldest son and his younger siblings. They say he went mad, locked the others in the cellar. They were found weeks later, all of them, starved, except for the boy." "What happened to him?" I asked. "They say he was taken to an asylum, died there. But people around here always said his spirit went back, that he never really left." I left the cafe with my stomach twisting. It lined up too well with what I saw. The door under the stairs, the knocking. I knew I had to go back, even though every part of me screamed not to. I returned to the Ellis house the next day, armed with flashlights, a crowbar, and a camera. I parked farther out this time and approached quietly, the air heavy with moisture and decay. The door was still slightly ajar. I stepped inside, went straight to the small door under the stairs. This time, I pried it open. A set of narrow steps descended into the dark. The air coming up smelled of dirt and mold. I clicked on my flashlight and started down. The basement was cramped, barely tall enough to stand in. The walls were stone, slick with moisture. At the far end were 3 small wooden cots, half rotted, chains bolted to the walls. Scratches marred the stone, desperate, chaotic lines. In the center of the floor was a circle drawn in what looked like old, dried blood. And then I saw him. Not directly, in the reflection of the flashlight against one of the rusted metal surfaces. A boy, thin, eyes hollow, face twisted in silent agony, watching me. I turned, but he was gone. Suddenly, the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut. I ran, fumbled my way back up, shoved the door open, gasping for fresh air. As I stumbled outside, I heard the knocking again, 3 times. From behind the door, I never went back. I quit the job 2 weeks later, moved out of the apartment, left Virginia entirely. But sometimes at night I still hear it, faint, behind the walls, 3 knocks, and I wake up with the bruises again. Story the end.